Fear is surely one of the most controlling emotions known to any human being. And as far as recovery goes, as one person recently told me, it is a pit bull at your throat. And I find a lot of truth to that. I also find that the more people are able to understand the anatomy of fear, the more they are truly able to come to awareness that most of the fear that we experience has nothing to do with what is going on here and now, that in fact most of the problems we have with fear is dragging some past traumatic experience of 20, 30, 40 years ago across the pages of today, smudging them up with their trauma and their pain, that the more we are able to understand that, the more power we have to not be a victim to fear. And that's what our recovery demands, that we find a way to defeat fear in our lives. Fear. The thought for today is fear. The lecture's on fear. Now, why fear? The reason is because fear that is not understood, fear that is not confronted, fear that consumes our life is one of our greatest enemies to the quality of our recovery. A life that is choked with fear is going to be a life that has a very low degree of happiness and serenity to it. And that's why we must talk about fear. How big a problem is fear in our life? Maybe 2 weeks ago, I was doing this lecture at a treatment center, and I asked this question about how big a problem is fear. And a man in the front row, I think he probably didn't want to be in treatment, said, well, how big a problem is an ice pick in your eye? Kind of made me think about, it certainly is a problem, and a life full of fear, maybe that is a pretty good analogy, that it is like having an ice pick in your eye. It causes all kinds of problems. Well, to be a little more specific, of the many different traumas that uncontested and not understood fear causes in our life, let me focus on three. Three main problems that fear causes. And the first one that I would like to share is this. Fear and joy cannot coexist. To the degree that fear is in our life, we are not going to enjoy our life. Fear cannot coexist with peace and serenity and happiness. A Siamese twin of fear is worry. A life that is full of fear is a life that is full of worry. Now, we've probably all heard the saying before, if you pray, why worry? And if you worry, why pray? See, and that's a nice saying, and it's a good program saying. But the fact is, if our life is full of fear, all the sayings and platitudes in the world don't work. And so we start to pray, let's say. We really work our third step and our 11th step. And in fact, we still have fear. And then that just becomes a reason, at least in our mind, why we failed again. And maybe why we don't deserve to recover. Think of the many things in your life that fear has destroyed. The celebrations that you never enjoyed because you were panicked about what was going to happen next. Think of all the educational, fun things that perhaps you could have done with family, with friends, or just by yourself, and you didn't do it because fear blocked the way. See, fear and joy cannot coexist. All right, the second thing that fear does, the second big problem that fear brings into our life, is that fear fixates us at the point of pain. Now, that's a little tricky. Let me say that again. Fear fixates us at the point of pain. The point is, as we will see in just a moment, that most of what we experience as soul-killing fear is not really so much what is happening here and now, that in fact most of the fear that destroys the spirituality and the happiness and the joy in our life really is an emotional reaction to a trauma or a series of traumas that happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago in our life. It's old stuff. So what happens when we don't contest this fear is that we get in a situation in the here and now, And what is causing the fear may very well have absolutely nothing to do with what is happening here and now. What it has to do with is some trauma in the long ago past that we've never confronted, we've never dealt with, and we've kept with us. So here now we get in this situation, and I'll give you some examples in just a second, and fear comes out like some big ugly monster under the bed grabbing us by the throat, and all that is happening is we are reliving the hurt and the trauma that happened way back when. So again, the point is, if you don't deal with your fear, the tragedy is not just that it happened way back when. The real tragedy is that we allow it to happen again and again and again. Fear is like some kind of stake that we take and drive through our heart or through our foot, and it absolutely fixates us back at that situation and that event that caused all the hurt and caused all the trauma in the first place. So the point is, why put up with it? See, we have choices. We do not have to live with that fear day in and day out if we understand what it's about. All right. The third thing that fear does, the third point of fear, is that it creates systems that guarantees a repetition of what causes our fear. Now, interesting to think about. For example, let's say that someone has a tremendous fear of success. Sounds crazy, but lots of people have a fear of success. If they let that fear win, rather than making the sales calls or going to school or educating ourselves or whatever may be, what we wind up doing is sitting in a coffee shop all day long rather than making the sales calls, or we spend forever getting ready and never actually do the things that make the success happen. Well, of course, the less we do the things that make success happen, the less success we have. And so what that fear has done is to create situations that simply guarantee the unending circle of situations that cause the fear. Somebody that has a tremendous fear of intimacy, and most recovering people have learned to have fear of intimacy. Even though it's what we want more than anything else in the world, it's also what our greatest fear is. So let's say someone who has a fear of intimacy comes off as being arrogant and know-it-all, and maybe if we're talking about males, some kind of macho caveman. Well, the more we let that fear trigger and be the cause of this kind of behavior, the less intimacy is ever going to be in our life, because who's going to put up with that kind of stuff? At least no one healthy is going to put up with that kind of behavior. So the more we let that fear act out in our life and we respond to that fear, the less intimacy we're going to have. The more fear we have, the more we guarantee a repetition of those situations. Now, if there's ever 3 good reasons for dealing with something, I don't know what's better than those. The reason to get rid of fear, to overcome fear, is because it will destroy our capacity for fun. It fixates us at the point of pain that we hated way back then, and it guarantees a continuing repetition of that kind of pain in our life. And we have a choice. We do not have to live under the bondage of this doggone fear. Now, next point. What then is fear? Let me share with you a definition of fear. Fear is the emotional response to perceived imminent danger. Fear is our emotional response to danger. See, and that's the difference between fear and anxiety. Anxiety is a generality. Anxiety has no particular focus. Just being generally uptight, generally nervous, generally feeling all wound up. That's anxiety. Fear always has a focus. Fear is always about afraid of something or someone or some situation, and specifically that person, that situation, that event, whatever it is, comes across to us as dangerous. See, imminent perceived danger, in your face danger. When we feel that's happening, the response to that is fear. Now, here's the point, and here's the critical point of this lecture. How imminent is the danger that we feel? And what I'm going to suggest to you again is that most of this fear that pulls us backwards, most of this fear causing us all of this trauma, has very little to do with what actually is happening in the here and now. And it has a great deal to do with some trauma in the past. Now, fear can be most appropriate. Fear is not an enemy. Fear is like a fire bell. And thank God, if there's a fire, thank God there's a fire bell. It says do something about it. If you're standing out in the street and there's a semi-truck roaring down at you 70 miles an hour and there's no driver in the truck, well, fear is totally appropriate. You should feel fear. It's telling us fight or flight. Take care of this dangerous situation. If you're standing out on a lake, on the ice, and you hear the ice start to crack, fear is absolutely appropriate. It's absolutely right. You know, we need to get off the ice or we're going to fall through. If you've just had sex with someone and they very smilingly look up and say, oh, by the way, I have AIDS, fear is appropriate. There's no reason not to feel fear. But what I'm talking about is there are many situations where the fear is not appropriate because the situation causing the fear doesn't warrant it. For example, your husband, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your kids, whoever, comes home and says, at work, we are going to have an office party or a picnic. I have to go, and I need you to come with me. You're expected to come. And this is you being in the company now of new people. Now, that's enough to cause many fear-based people to go into shock, not really knowing why. And of course, when fear is not really understood, we always justify it. Now, think about this, because some of you have been in this situation. What was your reaction to that very legitimate request to come to this situation? Maybe it's just a block party where new people are going to be there. Have you ever said things like, well, I'm not going to that. They're a bunch of hypocrite people. They're a bunch of dummies. They don't say anything interesting, and probably all they want to do is to make fun of me. It's not true. See, where is that kind of response coming from? The fact is, there may be all kinds of interesting people at that gathering if you let yourself talk and get to know them. The fact is, there may be somebody there that is important for you to meet if you allow that to happen and don't let fear destroy it. See, but the fact is, somewhere along the line, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you learned that new people are dangerous. You learned that meeting new people made you vulnerable. And vulnerable always translated into you being hurt. So here it is 30, 40 years later, and you are responding to this situation with the same emotional response of 40 years ago. That was true then. Back then, when you learned to be afraid, new people very likely were dangerous. Maybe whatever happened then really was abusive. It was traumatic. It caused you grave damage. But see, that doesn't mean it's going on now. Another perfect example. Again, the point is, how imminent is the fear that you feel? A dear friend of mine, 26 years in the AA program, 26 years of uninterrupted sobriety, doing just a wonderful job with his program. But at the meeting a week or so ago was talking about this. The tremendous fear that he has of causing other people inconvenience. And he said, it's just something inside of me. I don't understand it. It just makes me absolutely paranoid. How tense I get and full of fear when I cause anyone inconvenience. For example, and this man, again, is up in his 60s. He's been very successful. He talks about in traffic, and he's got this lovely, big, long Cadillac car. But let's say he's in traffic and he's going to make a left-hand turn, and there's oncoming traffic and he can't make this left-hand turn. He looks in his rearview mirror and hears a car behind him. And he starts to get nervous because he's thinking, this car behind me wants to move and I better get out of the way. And if it takes another 30 seconds or even 20 seconds, and he's looking in this mirror, now there's 3, 4, 5 cars behind him. And he said, I get so uptight and so nervous that many, many times I just drive, I don't turn left. I just drive on through, maybe go 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks out of my way because I cannot stand the thought of these people behind me being inconvenienced. And again, the point is, these people behind him may not be nervous at all. They may not be even thinking negative thoughts, and even if they are, so what? I mean, he's got a right to be in traffic, and if he has to turn left, he has a right to back traffic up a bit to turn left. Everybody does. But see, it's not a 60-year-old man sitting in the car. That's the point. It's still that 7-year-old kid, that 8-year-old kid, that every time he caused someone inconvenienced, he was punished. Every time he made anybody unhappy, he got smacked up alongside the head. He was telling the story, for example, he grew up on a farm, and he said, as a little 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, I'm out in the field, it's 120 degrees, and I come in to get a drink of water, because that's the only way you could get water in those days. He said, my mother was at the water bucket with this big ladle, and this little kid coming in the field, middle of summer, screaming sweat, and she said, he said she'd smack me with that ladle and say, stop being so lazy. I got things to do, and here you are coming in here wanting to drink water. Get back out in the field and earn your keep. Well, it's 60 years later. He's sitting in his car feeling as nervous as anything can. Why? How old is he when he's feeling that fear? And the point is, when you are feeling that fear, whether it's fear of conflict, whether it's fear of rejection, whether it's fear of commitment, all of the various kinds of fear, when you are feeling that, how old are you? See, what is the situation that you are really in? And what I'm suggesting to you, that most of the fear that consumes our life has nothing to do with the danger in the here and now. It has everything to do with past learned fears that we insist on dragging with us from the past into today. It's old smoke. And healing and freedom from this kind of fear is learning that it is totally possible to blow the smoke away. We have formed a fear group where I live. In fact, this man with a car that can't turn left is in that group, making wonderful progress, sighting group. The whole basis of this group is around the fact that we need to identify something that we are afraid of, self-disclosure, conflict, whatever it may be, and when we feel fear, to ask ourselves, how old am I when I'm feeling this fear? See, where am I when I feel this fear? And again, the point is, you're not in the 90s. Chances are where you are when you feel this fear is back in the 50s or the 60s or the 40s, whatever it may be. Where are you? See, and what's going on? And my dear friend in the car with the left-hand turn, he often tells himself now, I'm not going to get hit when I come in for a drink. See, that's old stuff. I don't have to put up with that. This isn't then. This is now. And I have a choice to make about what kind of fear and what kind of quality of life I am going to enjoy. I do not have to let that fear run my life if I understand where it's coming from. As I mentioned, fear has a specific focus. Now, let me share 3 specific faces of fear, 3 kinds of fear. There are many different kinds, but just see if you can relate to these. The first one is fear of conflict. To what degree do you think you have a fear of conflict? And if that is true, when you get in situations where that fear comes up and grabs you by the throat, is controlling your life, how old are you Where are you and what's going on? One of the gentlemen in our fear group, who also happens to have 9 years in the program. Now, this is not only for recovering alcoholics, this group. It's just for people trying to get control of their life. But this man also happens to be in the program. He has a great deal of this fear of conflict. Now, the way it translates for him, and this is why I want to use this example, his fear of conflict does not translate into passive, whipped dog kind of a response. What he learned is, in the name of conflict, be a bully. He's a big, strong, strapping man, and what he learned, rather than negotiate, what he learned, rather than deal honestly with conflict, is intimidation. Be a bully, get angry, get mad, and you can get what you want. And as he shared about his particular anger, he said, as a kid, if I was in the sandbox and I wanted the little red truck, I went and grabbed the red truck, hit the kid that had it, and all of a sudden I had a red truck. Now, that doesn't maybe sound like fear, but you see, it was the fear, the way that he learned to respond to that. My point is, he was trying to work a program as hard as he could, maintaining sobriety, went down to a party. He lived in an apartment. They were having a party downstairs, making too much noise, and he thought he was working, in control of this, went downstairs to try to tell him to quiet down. The guy that answered the door was not as polite as my friend wanted him to be, came to words, came to a fight, and he wound up in jail. Never drank, but he wound up in jail. Self-esteem shot, full of sadness, full of grief, full of guilt. But see, the point was his old fear won. He grew up in an orphanage, and he said every single day you had to fight to get your food. He said every month or so they'd pile us kids from the orphanage in the bus, and they'd take us into town to see a movie, and all the kids from the town would circle the bus, and you had to get off that bus swinging. If you didn't learn to fight, you were just going to get creamed. Here it is 40-some years later, and he's still doing it. See, that fear of conflict, is it true for you? How do you deal with it? Fear of rejection. In the name of fear of rejection, do you not test relationships? Do you find yourself absolutely panicked at the thought of people getting close to you? Again, even though there may very well be nothing that you want more than love and closeness, do you find that there's a pattern, a repetitive pattern in your life, that as soon as someone gets close, you find a reason to run, to leave them? See, and where did you learn that love hurts? Where did you learn you don't have a right to be loved? And the same thing with that fear of commitment. Fear of commitment is just another name for vulnerability. If, in fact, as a result of some past learned trauma or series of traumas, you learned to be afraid of sharing, then chances are now you keep secrets. Chances are now you never let anybody know what's really going on with you, even if the relationship isn't terribly close. You may have a terrible time even making a commitment to show up at 6 o'clock for supper at a friend's house. Somehow, having nothing to do with what is going on in the here and now, you take some past hurt and some past trauma, drag it into today, and that's the fear. What's the answer? The answer to overcoming fear is to first of all understand it, then to confront it, and then to act in a way that is not based in fear. At one of our groups, there was a man who was losing his hair, and he was terribly afraid of becoming bald because there was all that fear. If you're bald, people aren't going to love you, and somehow you're a less of a person. And understanding his fear, he went out and shaved his head absolutely bald, showed up at meeting like a watermelon. And people said, Joe, what are you doing this? How did this happen? He said, I was afraid of being bald. And he said, you know what? I ain't afraid anymore. He said, so what? Nothing happened. That's how you overcome fear. You understand it, you confront it, and you do whatever it takes, the behavior that it takes, so that you are able to live in the here and now. So you're not simply always reliving traumas from the past. And the fact is, I don't think anyone can do that alone. The fact is, support is terribly important. Find someone that you can share your fear with. Find someone or a group that you can share your agenda with, what you're going to do. And find someone or a group who will support and encourage you as you slowly but surely climb out of fear. The choice really is ours. None of us have to live a victim of fear. As we summarize the material we shared with you in this lecture into these 3 questions, the point again is the more they are shared, the more they are internalized, the more effective they are going to be. So allow me to share with you these 3 questions about fear. Number 1, what establishes fear? What is the anatomy of fear? What makes fear up? The more we understand what fear really is, the more power we have to change it. The second question, always trying to make it personal, how does fear affect your life? Is there a specific face of fear that specifically gives you problems? Fear of conflict, fear of commitment, fear of rejection, whatever it may be. How does fear affect your life? What is the price that you pay for fear being in your life? And of course, the third question is, what is the remedy? What is the program that you can internalize and practice in your life, giving you the power to spring past fear, to live a life in the sunshine, not a victim to the paralyzing grip of fear in your life? How do you do that?